Welcome back. Well, the Transnet strike now well underway. Members of the SATAWU union joining members of the union UNTU in demanding an increase of around 12%. Transnet's offering just 4% in a one-off payment of 5,000 rand. There are all sorts of implications to this. Miners can't move their metals out of the country. Berry farmers say this puts 30,000 jobs at risk. They can't move their fruit out of the country. Patrick Deale is a labour analyst and labour lawyer. He joins us now. Patrick, good afternoon to you. When we have a strike like this, the union is demanding 12%. Transnet's offering just 4%. Such a big gap. What does that tell us about what's going on within the two sides?
Good afternoon, Stephen. I think it tells us that the kind of target for the negotiations from the union is probably midway between those percentages. In other words, around the inflation cost of living index, I think is around about the 7% mark. So I think this is part of the strategy or the tactics, if you like, to try and hone in on at least getting an increase which is equal to, or perhaps a smidgen more than the inflation rate of about 7.6%. So it's positional at that stage. I think aiming at that. I think that's the original or the current intention, the target, if you like.
In other words, this is sort of how negotiations are done. If you want a certain thing, you ask for more. We've all done it.
Exactly, and typically speaking, the unions will obviously come on high, the employers will come in low, but traditionally what has happened over the years, which has almost become a practice, that they home in around the annual inflation rate for that particular negotiation period, and they try and target a kind of 1% below or 1% above. To sort of get into that kind of bracket of negotiation, which they see as the sort of settlement zone. And the closer they get to it, say the employer, I'm not saying that they will, get to sort of close to 6%. The next move would be 6.1, 6.2. So it'll end up being tiny and tiny slices until someone blinks. And I think that's the kind of thinking. And the union has, I've just seen from media reports and so on, they are saying, we're digging in on the double digits and so on. And, on the other hand, what Transnet is just saying is that, look, the bank is empty. We don't have the money. And that's why we started with 1.5 or round about there. And 4% is actually generous in the context of the contents of our wallet at the moment. So, whether or not Transnet is going to be able to move from that, if it's got any more money in the bank or wriggle room, is doubtful. But the gap between 4% and 7% is pretty huge in relation to the kind of numbers that we're talking about. 20, 40,000 employees and a wage bill with a compounding effect. So I think we're in a tight spot here to try and close that gap.
It's easy to say to the unions, look, 12% is just ridiculous, you're not going to get it. I would imagine, though, that union leaders are perhaps under more pressure from their members than ever before. After the pandemic in particular, people who still have a job are possibly looking after more people than they used to, they have more mouths to feed. As a result, there's a lot more pressure on the entire situation. Would that be right?
Absolutely no doubt about that. You're spot on. And let me tell you that being a union leader, being a union official in the negotiations, acting on a mandate of its members to try and get the best deal possible is a seriously difficult task for union officials to pull off because they're acting on that mandate. Remember, they've got to go. The process of mandating is a recycling process. They've got to go. They've got to discuss the state of play, the state of nation, the industry, and in their personal circumstances. They must get a mandate, and if they go, and then the workers say, well, go and get it for us. Yes, they might send their negotiators off with a bit of kind of knowing that there'd be a bit of wriggle room to go a bit less than that. But then the leaders have got to go back and say, well, look, I'm sorry, we can't move there. And now what do we do? And they kind of, they have the toughest negotiations are actually between the union leaders and the members because of that, quite frankly.
It would seem different strikes will have different dynamics to them. But it would seem that Transnet, in particular, is one of those areas where the workers have quite a lot of power because there's a very real impact very quickly. I mean, in mining, and we all know this, before a strike, often a mine will sort of build up a stockpile. It will continue to sell product that it's stored, sometimes for years. And in fact, we've seen that quite recently. With Transnet, if the ports close, the berries literally go off and can't be sold. So would I be right to say this is one of those strikes where the pressure is actually more on the employer than on the worker?
Undoubtedly. But also, Stephen, it's more on the consequences to the entire country, to us as citizens, to the economy. Because eventually, as we know, the transport system, the Transnet rail and other systems that they operate is equivalent to the kind of literally the lifeblood of the country. And if it stops, the consequences are just enormous. And so the pressure is huge on the employer to settle, and there's no, but also on the state and government. And there's no surprise, really, that no less than the minister has pitched up at the CCMA to try and settle this thing as a demonstration of how important this is. But remember also, too, that because of the impact of it on the economy, the court of public opinion plays a huge role in this. What will the public think about a strike under these conditions, basically in this context, this environmentally, economically tough situation we're in? What will be the perception of unions and their employees going on strike in these situations, which is also a very powerful kind of element to this thing. So, and the court of public opinion could, in a sense, dilute the kind of pressure that's on the employer, because the public doesn't want this, and the employees in other businesses, which are employed by companies that use Transnet, don't want this. They'll all suffer, and a lot of them will be SATAWU-related, federation members as well. So it has a ripple effect, not just on employees at Transnet, but employees in a whole range of other areas. They're going to say, now, come on, guys, what you're doing is going to be damaging, but we understand your cause, but it's going to be damaging us as well. So the dynamics of it are very complicated and tend not only to focus on the pressure on the employer, which is enormous, actually.
So Thulas Nxesi, as you say, the Minister of Labour and Employment, he's been at the CCMA. Is there much he can do? I mean, legally maybe not, but I would imagine that there is the power of persuasion. He would be, trying to twist as many arms as he can. Is there much that government can do here?
You're right. It's only the power of persuasion. There's no legal, something legally he can do to take matters into his own hands. But so he can try and persuade Transnet to give a little bit more. I mean, that's the most he can do. He can also try and persuade the unions to come down a little bit, to at least to get within touching distance of an agreement. But perhaps, Stephen, I think what is often missed in these, the general practice of wage negotiation in this country as it's evolved over time, is that essentially, in my opinion, it's largely become dysfunctional. First of all, you're negotiating 1 year's deal at a time, mostly. And this round of wage negotiations, damaging as it is, happens once a year. And in between, there's a kind of resting period before it all starts over again, which in itself I think is very damaging. But also because the range of settlements is normally, as I mentioned at the beginning, is just below or just above inflation. And so you kind of know really where you're going to settle right before you even start, generally speaking. And so we need to, I think, look at ways of not undermining the rights or freedom of association, the right to strike and everything that's related to constitutional labour law rights, but to look at procedures. And there are already progressive procedures, what we call alternative dispute resolution procedures, where you say, instead of going on strike, let's go on into a different process where we go into, for example, a mediation, where we, if you can't agree, you try and get as close as possible, and then you give the mediator, and if you can't resolve it, you give the mediator the power to say, okay, I'm going to decide between the last offer made by the employer and the last offer demand made by the union, and I'm going to decide between the two, and that'll be final and binding. And so that encourages the employer to get as close as possible to where they're most likely to settle, but also to bring the union down to an area which they could possibly, settle at. Because the arbitrator is going to choose between the employer's last offer or the union's last demand. And in that way, that's a rational economic way to deal with, wage deadlock disputes, rather than taking to the streets and running the risks and the damage that it all happens. I think it's really time to look at those creative ways. Are there others as well? That's just one example of dealing with these kinds of things to avert the kind of... this is a crisis which could happen if this goes to a full-blown strike. I don't think it will go to a full-blown strike, but I think this would be properly serious if it did. But we need to look for a different procedure, a way of doing this, and maybe the Minister can help with that.
Patrick Deale, thank you very much indeed. Really do appreciate it. A lot more to talk about there. Patrick Deale is a Labour lawyer and analyst. Well.